Started in just a minute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lost track.
Perfect.
You okay, Indira? You all settled? Yes. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. Just have a few people coming in the back. We'll let them get in the door. So welcome, everybody. Our session is called Misinformation Whack-A-Mole. Who is doing what? And most importantly, what might be missing? So many of you, how many people in this room were at this festival a year ago? 1 year ago? Oh, everybody, okay, just about. So you may recall that pretty much everybody's hair was on fire about a year ago. It was just, not too long after the US presidential election, a little longer still after Brexit, and the beginnings of what we would, find out about misinformation, disorders on the platforms, and the way, and more about trolls, and more about bad actors, and more about political operatives. A lot of that was beginning to unfold, and sort of, if I had to summarize the tone here a year ago, it was, oh my God, this is real, this is happening. As the global journalism community and global tech community, what are we going to do about it? So 1 year later, I would say there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is it's all even worse than we imagined. But the good news is, in the last year, there has been just an incredible flowering all over the world of varying initiatives, startups, at the tech companies, in academia, with publishers. All kinds of organizations have sprung up out of nowhere with fantastic funding coming from many corners about how we're going to deal with how we're going to get the genie back in the bottle, which of course will be impossible. That's impossible, but how we are going to think through and make sure that we can protect, in many ways, global quality information and make sure that it gets into the right hands. So the great news is there's lots of organizations, and many people are talking about those throughout the many sessions this week in Perugia. The purpose of this conversation is about how can we make sure that we, the we, which is all of the various efforts going on all over the world, how do we make sure that we know what each other is doing and that we support each other and then we collaborate across sort of the continuum of misinformation needs? And by collaborate, I don't mean consolidate. Nobody, certainly I, and I don't think anybody in this panel would suggest, you stop doing what you're doing, leave it for us. The more, the merrier. That's fantastic. However, we will be so much more effective together if we are working together, know what each other's doing, and making sure that we're filling in critical gaps, again, along that continuum of needs. So there's been quite a few discussions that are just starting around this now that we're sort of more than a year into, what we know about our new dark misinformation world. There was, for example, at the World Economic Forum held a convening a couple of weeks ago that Craig and I were at. Jeff Jarvis, I know, is in the back of the room, was there and also helped organize. And there's many other efforts. So this is a continuation of that process. But a lot of these efforts have something in common. And that something in common has to do with the guy sitting to my left. So Craig was instrumental in helping make that World Economic Forum convening happen, as well as instrumental in many of the initiatives that I said have been, either existing long-time initiatives or ones that are springing up all over the world. So I want to, and in fact, everybody on this panel has been in some way supported and funded by Craig. So I want to actually turn it to Craig for a minute to talk about his point of view and what he's doing. And after that, I will introduce each of the panelists about their work, and we'll go into a conversation. One disclosure, because we all are journalists, that I need to make, which is among the many things that I do, I work with a communications agency called Weber Shandwick, and we are working with Craig on his communication efforts, so I just want to disclose that to everybody. And with that, I turn it over to you, Craig.
In high school, like 50 years ago, Mr. Shulsky helped me understand that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. The press should keep our democracies healthy, and our immune system in 2016 failed us. But for years prior to that, I had some idea that that was happening, so I started learning what I could. Because I'm an old school nerd, a 1950s style nerd, for me to be involved in communications is a bit of a crime against nature. Nevertheless, I started learning things, and then I started putting my money where my mouth is, learning what journalistic institutions were doing trustworthy journalism, and what journalistic institutions were leading the way for reporting in general that would be trustworthy. So I started, again, putting my money where my mouth is, an expression from the US, which may not be a universal expression, but it meant that I'd have to be personally involved in terms of my time and personal energies and money. But that's why I'm here, and frequently at journalist conventions where funders may not normally attend, because I figure I have to be personally involved to become real about these things. So there's a lot of efforts involved. I'm heavily involved in the Trust Project, which is about how, from a news consumer's point of view, a news outlet can commit to trustworthy behavior, like a code of ethics, and then corrections practices, such that when a mistake is inevitably made, they'll fix it. To enforce that, we need, good journalistic ethics, plus what's now called an international fact-checking network, which Indira is involved with out of the Poynter Institute. We need people who will practice what we preach, like you see in WikiTribune, which Peter Bale's involved with. And there's also the News Integrity Initiative, which is an umbrella organization coordinating a number of these other efforts which are going on. The upside of the wake-up call of the elections is that we have a lot of good people doing a lot of good work right now. The downside is that there's too many for us to keep track of. The News Integrity Initiative helps with a lot of that. Because, again, a lot of things are happening. There's a lot of fact-checking initiatives. There's a lot of organizations figuring out flows of disinformation and harassment. And even when we see some redundancy, and I fund some redundant efforts because finally, throughout the world, and the US as well, reporters are coming under attack, sometimes physically. So one final area of interest is, how do we protect journalists doing their job? There's a lot more to this. I'm going to stop now.
Okay. By the way, those of you in the back of the room, there's some seats up front. I should note that I failed the minimum requirement for a moderator, which is to introduce the person who was about to speak. I introduced you as Craig, but I didn't say, of course, hopefully what all of you know is Craig is the founder of Craigslist, and now is full-time dedicated to his philanthropy through Craig Newmark Philanthropies. So let me just introduce the rest of the panelists, and then we're going to go into our conversations. To Craig's left is Joyce Barnathan, who is the president of the International Center for Journalism, ICFJ. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing quality journalism worldwide. She has a long career prior to that as a journalist, including being executive editor for Business Week and many executive roles throughout Business Week, was based in Asia for a long time, and is one of the greats. And I should disclose also, since I'm continuing on the disclosures, that I'm very proud to sit on the board of ICFJ. So then next we have Jennifer Choi. Jenny is the Associate Director for Strategic Partnerships of the News Integrity Initiative at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism in New York. She has years of experience at the intersection of local news, community engagement, and philanthropy. Most recently, she was the Vice President and Chief Content Officer for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. Prior to that, she was at the McCormick Foundation in Chicago. She'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about what they're up to. Next is Indira Lakshmanan. She holds the Newmark, you may recognize that name, Chair in Journalism Ethics at the Poynter Institute. Previously, she was and she is currently a Boston Globe columnist. In her career, she's reported for The Globe, Bloomberg, International New York Times, NPR, PBS, Politico. She was a foreign correspondent covering wars, interviewing dictators, and what have you. So tremendous experience there. And last but not least, Peter Bale, who is the launch editor for WikiTribune, a community-driven news site created by Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales. He's also the president of the Global Editors Network. Most recently, he was the CEO for the Center for Public Integrity, and he's been a news executive prior to that for places too numerous to mention. So let's jump right in. Joyce, I'm going to start with you. So you have a program called Truth Buzz, which I'd love for you to talk to us about, that creates solutions for fact-checking that newsrooms can adapt. But importantly, your focus is on the developing world. And so, my question to you is, how can the work that you're doing, both to make sure that news consumers in the developing world get the information they need to be participants in their communities, and how, and on the other side of the coin, how can global citizens, all of us in the room, the work that you're doing, making sure that the stories from those regions reach us, how is that work? How do you see that intersecting with other global initiatives around the world?
Well, thanks, Vivian, and thanks for being such an excellent board member. I also want to thank the two people on my side for funding initiatives at ICFJ at the International Center for Journalists. For those of you who don't know, we've been around for 34 years. We were founded by journalists for journalists, and our goal is to promote quality journalism around the world, and therefore fighting misinformation is a key part of what we're all about. Vivian asked me to talk a little bit about Truth Buzz, which is an initiative that Craig funded, and it has a bit of relevance now that I'm here in Italy, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Truth Buzz was a contest to try to find ways that the truth can travel as fast as falsehoods. So there were studies I heard this morning, people talking about how misinformation travels and the visuals and this and that. How can we compete in that sphere so it's not long exposés on fact-checking, but really, really effective ways to get the truth to travel quickly? And I call it actually the storytelling of fact-checked information, or the effective storytelling of fact-checked information. And we had a contest last year, a global contest. We called for entries all over, and the winner was from Italy. It was from, forgive me if I don't pronounce it right, Pagella Politica, and they used short videos that basically evaluated politicians' claims by working out the math on a chalkboard very, very quickly. So one of the political parties said that they had more degrees than everybody else, and they did the math and showed on a chalkboard, blah, 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 and it was incredibly effective, spread quickly, and it was, there was an entertainment value to it, but it was all about busting, lies. Now, again, thanks to Craig, we're basically doing Truth Buzz 2.0, which is how do we take these effective techniques and more to newsrooms in 5 of the most populous nations of the world. And so we're in the process of looking for fellows who will help spearhead this effort. And obviously the goal is very practical. Let's get as many of these great techniques in as many newsrooms as possible so that we can help fight misinformation. We have quite a few other initiatives that we're working on. We've helped, Indira's part of the fact-checking group that's around the world, but a lot of those groups were we at least has some hand in at least starting them up or giving them startup funds or creating them, including Africa Check, which got some seed money from an innovation contest that our Knight Fellows, and we run the Knight International Journalism Fellowships, which these fellows are there to create a global culture of news innovation. And in conjunction with our Knight Fellows in Africa and Code for Africa, we've helped create Pesa Check, which is a East African fact-checking initiative, which has been very effective in checking statements during the Kenyan elections. We also have a new Knight Fellow from Peru, who is about to create a fact-checking guide in Spanish based on her experience launching a fact-checking organization at a Peruvian news organization that she co-founded called Ojo Publico. So the site has this fact-checking site called Ojo Bionico, and it's the first Peruvian fact-checking site, and it's launched in advance of the elections there. I guess there's a lot of activities that we're doing, and I guess the one thing that I discovered while I was here is that we do need to share and collaborate the initiatives that we're working on. And I'd like to volunteer that anybody who has initiatives or work that they're doing or services or whatever, offer it to the International Journalists Network, ignet.org, which is also run by ICFJ, but it's a neutral platform. I don't know if many of you members or signed up for IJNet. Well, if you have, you should sign up right away. It's a free service. It's in 7 languages. I'm sorry, not Italiano, but it's in 7 languages. And it basically is tips, training opportunities, all sorts of knowledge for our field. And we'd love to be able to aggregate a lot of the misinformation campaigns, misinformation tools, services on there so that we can spread the word across the world.
That's great, thank you. And we're going to come back to sharing of best practices a little bit later in the conversation. I'm going to jump over to you, Peter, and ask you first to just tell us exactly what WikiTribune is, because it's very new, and I think there might be some misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about it. And but it is fundamentally, I know it's fundamentally our participatory journalism, which is you have professional journalists, and you're working with in collaboration with the audience, like Wikipedia. So it'd be interesting to know, I want you to talk about what you're doing and also how you are collaborating with other open platform journalism efforts.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me. And I won't tell too much about WikiTribune because my colleague and the co-founder, Orit Kopal, is doing her own session with Dan Gilmore. The thing that I've been brought in to do, and which I've done and will shortly leave having done, is create a professional team of journalists in order to drive the core content of WikiTribune as it is at the moment. Our ambition is within 2 years for that content to at least matched by what's coming in from the community. I can tell you that it is extremely difficult for a community product for ordinary citizens to create actual journalism in real time. And that doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. But what a community is extremely good at is fact-checking. So what we've done, and I'll focus predominantly, if you don't mind, on the journalism side of it, because that's what I've built rather than the community side of the platform, is we have a team now of about 12 people stretched between London, Dublin, New York, Portland, Oregon, and Nelson in New Zealand, which is the new hub of 24-hour news reporting, not because Peter Thiel's there. And the idea of that is it gives us 24-hour coverage, and that has actually worked extremely well so far. We're producing between 4 and 12 stories a day from that team. We run a core briefing, which effectively is a description of the top 3 to 7 stories happening in the world at any given moment. But we'll then make a choice about which ones we choose to go in. And I've adapted Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, which many of you will know is used by health services around the world to stop people leaving scalpels in other people's tummies. And the point of that is we've codified the core elements of journalism into a program and a set of checklists which the youngest journalist in the world can do and become very effective. It's not dissimilar, although nowhere near as sophisticated as the Bloomberg Way. It's a very, the Bloomberg way allowed Bloomberg to grow incredibly fast. This is a much simpler set of checklists for journalists to work out what it is that we're trying to do. So what Jimmy is trying to achieve with this is very much a Wikipedia-style model. His ambition and his starting point is a neutral point of view. I have struggled to deliver completely on a neutral point of view because what I've really, I've had to go back to my own first principles as a journalist in this, and I think that starts from fairness and objectivity. I spent 18 years at Reuters. It is about objectivity. So I push towards neutrality. I think in certain areas you can't really get to neutrality because I don't believe that you can have a story which said slavery, good or bad, you decide. So that is that, that becomes a slightly binary thing. So what we're trying to do with the journalistic team is write fair, appropriate, incredibly well backgrounded and incredibly well linked information. What that's now generated is quite a good volume of interaction with the community. What we've also found is that there is remarkable, because the community is respected, the point of Jimmy's approach to this is to try and put the community into the same equality as the journalists. And I think I will elaborate on this when we get to questions, but there is a real problem with this event, which is that the audience and the community are not here. And we are still talking to each other. And we have to stop talking to each other and start talking to them. And I can tell you, if you embrace them, the politeness and the effectiveness and the appreciation of being taken seriously is remarkable. So, for example, a friend of mine who works in a newspaper the other day, it's a very expensive, high-quality newspaper which has an extremely high subscription price. And they said all of the women there, even under barriers, are getting the most appalling misogynistic shit thrown at them every day. That is completely unacceptable, and it will not happen if you actually have a dialogue with those people. So you can't shut off the bad people. Jimmy has a slightly, it's wrong to call it naive, but a very passionate belief that the good people will drive out the bad. I don't really see that necessarily in Facebook or on Twitter and so on, but his belief is that the good will drive out the bad. And I can tell you on the WikiTribune platform, despite having a very strong, high number of quite young women, for example, they have experienced almost no unpleasant misogyny from our community so far. It's possibly because the community is relatively small and many of them are Wikipedians, but as you know, Wikipedia has a problem with men. But on WikiTribune, I can tell you that the audience has been remarkably polite and civilized so far and appreciative of being engaged. I do think, so just to go back to this point about the audience and listening to them, I strongly believe, and I've known Craig quite a long time, we are in a battle against ignorance at the moment. And that is it may sound pretentious to say that, but I think that's what's really going on behind this. And facts are not enough. People are believing in things at the moment. People's beliefs cannot necessarily be moved aside by facts. And so I think showing our homework journalistically is extremely important. I think that's one of the best things we do at WikiTribune at the moment, and we can be a lot better. Where did the story come from? Who's reporting it? What are my sources? Can I show you the transcript of the interview that I did? Can I give you an audio of and really drill down on this? And the more I look, having now worked at WikiTribune for a while and built this platform, the more I look at other newspapers and other media outlets, the more I think they need to do this. It's really crucial. It's not, where did you get that information? How can I go deeper? How can I go to, and we link to Wikipedia 10, 15, 20, 30 times in a story because it's where if you want to drill down, you can drill down. And if I may just mention before I finish, the Trust Project by Sally Lerman, a woman at the Markula Center for Applied, I often say for applied athletics, but applied ethics, I think is the core of best practice. I built my part of WikiTribune entirely based on the minimum viable product of Trust Project. It is a fantastic set, and I would urge you to look at it and adopt it. Even if you don't do it all, it's the most proven way, because it's been tested by surveys and so on, of just having a few signals which show an audience that you've actually listened to them, that you're prepared to back up who's telling me this and why they're telling me this. So I do think that there's some best practice that you can grab without having to adopt an entire fact-checking model. People underestimate how important fact-checking is and how difficult it is. But there are various signals that you can send to the audience that will show that you've done your homework.
I think I would be surprised if we should have mentioned at the top, a contest for how many times the Trust Project and Sally Lehrman's name will be mentioned, and whoever hits the number will win a prize, because she is here with us in spirit, even if she's not here in person. I have one follow-up question before I move to the next moderator. With all due respect to the very sunny view of humanity, and that if you treat people civilly, they will treat people back, I think that's a lovely concept, but I wonder, as the community gets larger, how are you going to protect yourself against manipulation? I mean, organized groups who will try to manipulate your stories in a certain
so let me that is Jimmy's sunny view of it, and he is, and he built Wikipedia.
Clearly not a journalist.
No, but that's true, but he built Wikipedia, so he has had experience in this, and so I generally bow to him on this. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing working with him on this has been, we're based in the UK, so we're not covered by Section 230 of the US Communications Act, which means that the content on it is the responsibility of the person, not the platform. And we're also covered by British libel and defamation law. And that's been something of a revelation for Jimmy, being a First Amendment zealot, as am I. But, the First Amendment does not travel outside the United States other than on Facebook and Google and Microsoft, because they are covered by Section 230 of the US Communications Act, which allows them to not carry responsibility for what they're publishing. We take responsibility for what they're publishing. I would say that in Jimmy's ambitious and possibly highly risky view of this, that he believes crowds are self-regulating. That, everything we publish at the moment goes through a journalist before it's published. But all drafts are also visible to anybody out there, and that scares me rigid. So we are trying to draw a distinction between what can be seen and what we actually put our name behind as being published. So everything at the moment that is published has gone through a journalist and through an editorial process and should be fair and reasonable and balanced. But you're absolutely right, there are some terrifying risks in this, but from Jimmy's point of view, it's a risk worth taking, and he believes that Wikipedia gives the ground for taking that risk.
Okay, thank you. Indira, I want to come to you next to talk a little bit about, what you're doing around, with a focus on sort of trust, transparency. I have a feeling you too will mention Sally Lehrman and her work, but talk a little bit about what you're doing at Poynter and how that work transfers to what other groups are doing.
Thanks. For those of you who are not familiar with Poynter, Poynter is a leading nonprofit journalism institute in the U.S. that's based in St. Petersburg, Florida, and our role is to do training and writing and thought leadership for journalism, not just in the U.S. but around the world. So the role that I play is a role that was created last year thanks to the generosity of Craig Newmark, and the way I see my role is my primary audience is journalists, so newsrooms and journalists at large. And what I work on is thinking about standards and how, for me, the overriding thing is how can we restore trust in journalism, because trust is so damaged. And this is not a new problem. It's not, I don't want to pretend it's a Trumpian problem. It's something that has existed for decades, and all the surveys from Gallup to Pew to, we did our own survey last year, the Poynter Media Trust Survey that we released in December. All the surveys show that trust in legitimate fact-based media is down because of a variety of factors, and we could have an entire conversation about that, about why trust in media is down. I personally think that it has its roots in under President Reagan, when the FCC deregulation allowed for the end of the fairness doctrine, and the rise in cable news and talk radio, and the sort of proliferation that was initially 1,000 flowers blooming, but that also led to a lot of angry and partisan and polarized media that may have existed in the past, in the pre-3 network era, but we had gotten used to 3 networks and this sort of concept of fairness in journalism. Anyway, I think that a lot of what goes to trust and rebuilding trust is we, first of all, have to hold ourselves accountable. We as journalists and we as news organizations need to do a better job than we're doing now. A better job in terms of ensuring accuracy at the front end of anything that we publish. We can't be governed just by this, what has really become a 24-second news cycle. It's a Twitter-driven news cycle where people have the instantaneous reaction, and I include myself in this. I'm also guilty of this, is as soon as we hear something, we want to be the first to get it out there instantly. And we can't let that become the overriding factor. Accuracy still has to be absolutely number one. We have to vet it. So I think that's the first thing. We have to be better about accountability when we make mistakes and own it. And, you know, there's a huge difference between when CNN made a mistake last year that had to do with Scaramucci. For those of you who are Americans, you know what I'm talking about. And 3 people had to resign over that. They did a sort of expose of how did we make this mistake and what happened, versus Fox News, which ran this huge Seth Rich, you know, supposed investigation of this DNC staffer who they say was murdered over WikiLeaks. And then when their primary source came out after the story ran and said, that's not right, you know, that's not correct, I can't stand by what they're saying I said, Fox merely took the story down without ever explaining what went wrong or describing it. So accountability and owning your mistakes is huge. I also think from the front end, it's critically important that we draw back the curtain on journalism. And I think that we as journalists don't understand that not everybody gets journalism. Like very, very smart people who are not journalists don't understand what we do and how we do it. And everywhere that I go and talk about trust, someone in the audience inevitably will raise their hand and say, we can't trust you, you journalists who use anonymous sources. You just let people call you up on the phone and tell you stuff and you print it. And I have to stop and say, no, that's not what an anonymous source is. That's not how anonymous sourcing works. It's not like somebody calls me up with a sock over the phone and says, Indira, I have a great tip for you. And then I'm like, oh, you know, and I type it up. That's not what anonymous sourcing is. You know, and people, they're astonished when you say, no, it's actually, I've talked to 5 people or 10 people at the White House and the State Department. I told my editor their names. I've vetted the information myself and verified that it's true. I simply can't tell you because their jobs are at risk. Or when I was a reporter in Asia, their lives are at risk, or whatever. And we need to do a better job of, in every sentence, saying, you know, said 10, you know, White House and State Department officials who could not be named because their jobs were on the line, or said a 35-year-old peasant in this Chinese village X who couldn't be named because of the risk of arrest by the Chinese government. You know, we need to be as transparent as we can about what we're doing and explaining how we got what we got, or else why should anyone believe that we're not just inventing stuff out of whole cloth? So that, I think, is really important. I would be happy to come back and talk about the work that my excellent colleagues at Poynter do, who run the International Fact-Checking Network, which is really where they're trying to, and PolitiFact, which also belongs to Poynter, where they're, you know, seriously trying to knock down every bit of misinformation. And Poynter, I will just say briefly, has just gotten a grant from Google to do something called MediaWise, where we are going to be doing media literacy for teenagers. And this is going to involve us training, basically, I don't want to use the word army because it's not military, but we're going to be training a cadre of teenage fact checkers, teaching teens how to be news literate by teaching them how to check facts themselves. So we have a couple jobs open, so anyone you know who would be excellent running that program or being a fact checker with it, please apply to Poynter. So I'd be happy to talk about all the things we do, from fact checking day to codes of principles and transparency. But just to put it out there, you know, the top line is, for me, the vital thing is trust and building trust and transparency by showing how the sausage is made. And every time, the Washington Post just started right after our ethics summit last December, 4 days later, the Washington Post launched a video series called How to Be a Reporter, which Marty Barron promised me. He said, we're going to be doing something really soon, you watch. And How to Be a Reporter sits down with the reporters in the very first episode who broke the Roy Moore story and interviews them about how did you get that? You know, the more that we are explaining what we do, the Wall Street Journal has a great little marketing series on this that highlights their reporters. The New York Times has tried to do some of this with, you know, Inside the Times. So the more that we explain what we're doing and how we do it, and are accountable when we do make mistakes, the more we're going to restore trust to our profession, which is, I think, the critical baseline thing we have to be doing here to distinguish ourselves from misinformation.
I think How to Be a Reporter would be the name for a great children's book as well.
Yes.
I'm actually not kidding. Jenny, I came to you last on purpose because in addition to, you know, the great work that's happening across CUNY Journalism School and its various spin-off initiatives, you guys are also you're not just funded, but you are a funder yourself of other organizations who are trying to tackle different aspects of the, again, the misinformation continuum. Tell us about how you are approaching that decision making, and about how you're looking at sort of mapping those grantees to make sure that those dots are being connected.
So I'm going to bring the conversation full circle to Craig's original story. I started off as a high school English literature and composition teacher, and my expertise was around critical literacy for teenagers. And then this was in 2000, and then fast forward, I'm at a foundation where we funded news literacy for 3 years. It was a $6 million initiative. Poynter was a key partner of ours. And what I learned from that initiative was that a lot of our teenagers and next generation audience consumers looked at us and said, who cares, why are you trying to sell us broccoli? And we get to consume whatever we want, et cetera, and you have to take us seriously, back to Peter's comment, taking audiences seriously and really listening to audiences. There was a huge disconnect between the newsrooms and the journalists that we were funding at the time to address news literacy, and that we were really looking at it from a prescriptive sense instead of from an audience-focused and centric sense. So we kind of we saw this dissonance kind of, just like Indira was just saying, starting to bubble up. And what was funny was we had scheduled a convening of funders the day after the US presidential election in 2016. And I think we all had hubris, the journalism and democracy funders. And so it was the day after the result, and we were just kind of looking at each other totally confused and had this existential dilemma. I mean, personally, I left journalism funding shortly thereafter for a brief amount of time. But I think what we learned was that we needed to address the hubris and really look at establishment culture and the assumptions that we were making, and really own the responsibility, as Indira and Peter just spoke of, that what's the journalist's role in all of this, and how do we hold ourselves accountable by listening better? And when we talk about trust, what do we mean by trust exactly? And from the NII perspective, so Molly Day Aguiar, who's my boss and managing director, she was doing very similar work in New Jersey, the work that I was doing in Chicago. And we both came from this experience that trust is really relationship building, and relationship building is very simple. It's when you ask yourself, personally and professionally, what is my criteria? What's my checklist and criteria of how I vet a person or colleague? How do I trust that person? Do you also check that criteria list for folks that you want to believe what you're saying? And I don't think that always matches, and that's the conversation that I was hearing. So when I came to NII, it was really interesting because I got back into the journalism and democracy funders from pre the US presidential election in 2016, and now we were talking about misinformation. And before we were talking about better coverage of Congress. So, you know, it's very interesting. What I'm learning is that this is a wicked problem, just as everyone has been saying. It's very difficult to talk about misinformation without also talking about a whole host of other issues. So we all each have a role to play. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of existing research, and some of us are really interested in organizing that research from an academic point of view. We know that our researchers really want access to data, especially from Facebook and Google, and that's hopefully happening, we'll see. And News Integrity Initiative is kind of like, if you have this huge Venn diagram of like these huge circles, we can play this really interesting role where not only do we have access to academics and journalism organizations, which we care the most about, quite frankly, And we want journalism organizations to understand their roles and responsibility of not fanning the flames. Secretly, I like to buy therapy and like meditation apps for all of our journalists, because there's this thing about breathing and not reacting and slowing down, and it's okay, and letting go, because there's less mistakes. And building trust and credibility is building that relationships, right? And taking time to build those relationships, and that's okay that it takes time, because we don't have to be slaves to the scoop anymore. Twitter fixed that, right? So, sorry. So, you know, I just feel like there are opportunities for us to look at tech and to look at, you know, our human behavior scientists and all the different kind of and really put all of this knowledge into practice, and to really figure out and map out, like, what are our roles in this ecosystem, because as Vivian said at the top of this panel, we're not one stakeholder or one sector is going to solve this really complicated problem if we're talking about this societal issue, this cultural issue. So that's kind of what we're working on.
Great. Well, follow-up question to you, actually to you or Craig or anybody on the panel. When you look across, you know, Jenny, you look across the different organizations that you're funding, or Craig, you look across the different organizations that you're supporting. What's missing? There's so, like I said, there's so much great work being done. What aspect along, again, this sort of continuum of needs and misinformation is not being tackled where we should be focusing our collective energy and perhaps our funding? Go ahead, Craig, if you want to.
One area which seems to be missing so far is summary fact-checking. That is, if you're, well, I'm a technology guy, so I'm thinking that if I'm building a newsfeed algorithm, when a news item comes in, I want to be able to decide if it should be recommended to readers or not. Fact-checking is not going to occur in real time. It's going to take a small amount of time, even with AI techniques. So I'd like to see if that news item comes from a news outlet which has a good record in terms of ethical practices and getting things right, and then fixing the things which aren't right. So I want to see a summary of what's happened. If the news item originates in part from an individual or an organization, say a president, I'd like to see if the summary fact check, let's say the PolitiFact scorecard, says that this group or individual has a record for telling the truth or not. So that summary of fact checking, which might be encoded in a nutrition label, I'd like to see that happening. And I don't think it's happening quite fast enough for my taste. And maybe I should do something about it.
Well, consider that a challenge being put out to the
Vivian,
out to the room. Go ahead.
Can I add a couple of things? So somebody just tweeted me, Jochen Spangberg, and said, engagement and interaction is also laborious and time-consuming, requiring respective resources and Sisyphus-like stamina. I'm wondering how many resources WikiTribune puts into that. And it does, but one of the things is we don't have an click-based advertising model. So I do look at page views just from a pure engagement point of view, but I'd like to recommend a product that many of you probably know, Content Insights, which is a product from Serbia and Prague, which gives you a very good sense of the economy of each piece and each writer. It essentially gives you a perspective where you can measure your journalists against the effort that they put in with the results that the story had. It's a very, very clever thing. But in a job I used to have, Craig, and again, not that we all come back and we're all sort of Craig's, I was going to use a rude word there, but Craig's chums. Craig said this thing to me once about do no harm. And, you know, I mentioned that I've been using the Atul Gawande checklist thing. And so do no harm is a kind of medical thing as well. And I think do no harm is actually, I've been thinking, what the hell, you know, he's a man of few words and he doesn't really look you in the eye, but when he says, do no harm, I think, what the hell does that mean? And I've been thinking about it a lot, and it's the same sort of thing with Jimmy, that he says these kind of profound things that people who've created great businesses do. And do no harm is the equivalent of just being fair. And if you go through any newspaper now, anything you've written yesterday, and think about how many loaded words were in there, how many of them were justified, or were they quick words, easy words, sloppy words that you can't actually justify it? So covering Davos recently, I used a headline which was it's certainly not a Wikipedia headline, and I was a bit worried that it might not even be a WikiTribune headline, because I said Justin Trudeau lectured the audience. And I felt that there was absolutely sufficient evidence in the quotes and in the evidence that I had in the story to justify the use of that word lectured. But that would have been too weighty a word to be used by Wikipedia. So if we go through some of those sort of sets of criteria, can I justify that thing? We were at grave risk the other day of describing somebody as pompous. You know, the pomposity may come out from the story. We described somebody recently as smart, and it really irritated me because there was no evidence about why they were smart. You know, don't tell me, you know, and it's, again, Matt Winkler from Bloomberg, complete lunatic, but he came up with show, don't tell. You know, his thing was show, don't tell, always. And actually some of these basics, I think, also in this panel, you've got some very sophisticated new things coming through. Reuters, Bloomberg, AP, and Agence France Presse have been doing this for the last 100 years.
I want to come back to the question of what's missing, though.
Okay. Can I also say just one?
Well, I'll let somebody else speak, and then I'll come back to you.
Right. Where's my gaffer tape?
Well, I think one thing that's missing is sort of a comprehensive look at what does it mean to fight misinformation? Because what you're hearing is sort of, we've got to fight it through being more accurate and being more transparent. We have to fight it by being better listeners and engaging with our communities. We've got to fight it by providing new tools so that we can speed fact-check information, all sorts of things. But I think that we've got to look at the totality of it and how it all fits together. Because I still think there are other aspects that we haven't even talked about yet. One of them, for example, is impact. If we can demonstrate to our audiences in very effective ways that our journalism is improving their communities or improving the world, that also helps build trust, and which is a project we're working on with News Integrity Initiative in Brazil. There's also the sustainability aspect of being able to support really great independent news sites who are being assaulted by media that is, or governments that are trying to shut them down, and they're the only voices of integrity. So we've got this huge, I think we have to define the universe and then gang up together to see how we're all working to tackle a very, very major issue.
Just to piggyback on that, there is yet, in terms of what's missing, we still don't really truly understand the impact of exposure to misinformation to, for example, political behavior. There's so much nascent information research out there. And Joyce, I agree with you. I mean, one of the dreams I have is for all of us that have been working in this space to, quite frankly, read each other's papers, because I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a different stakeholder and I'm like, hey, did you hear about this thing or this finding? And everyone's like, no, I haven't had time. I was doing my own research. So if we like all lock ourselves in a room and compare these notes, hello.
That's why I mentioned IJNet as a possibility, as a place where we can put a lot of the stuff, whether it's the research papers, very practical information. Yeah. And so, you know, it's at least you don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of reaching our audience, which is, you know, hundreds of thousands of journalists and media professionals.
So one of my colleagues at Poynter, and many of you may know him, he's Italian, so he's been coming to this conference a long time, Alexios Montzarlis, who's the head of the International Fact-Checking Network, has done an excellent job with this. If you go to IFCN, he has put online through the Poynter site, but he has an entire sort of International Fact-Checking Network platform in which he catalogs every single report that comes out on misinformation related to fact-checking and everything else. So there is a space where this all exists. And even I'm his colleague at Poynter, I can't read it all. But he posts every single survey, and we have an entire reporter who is dedicated, Daniel Funky, who is dedicated to just writing about fact-checking. And every report that comes out, every academic study, he's writing a story for Poynter.org. So one thing that we have seen in the research is this trend in the more recent studies showing that fact-checking can fix people's perception about one discrete thing. Like, let's say you fact check, the figures on Brexit and how much, whether Brexit is actually going to help the UK economy or not. So you may show people this information and you may change their mind about that one thing, but you're not going to change their behavior. They will say, well, okay, that's fine. You've convinced me, but I'm still going to vote for Brexit, because that's what's in my gut, or because it's really about immigrants or something else. They'll change the argument. We saw the same thing with Trump voters. You could prove to a Trump voter, that certain studies have shown, that certain things he was saying were wrong, like about the wall or immigrants. And they would again say, well, but it feels right. Okay, it may be wrong, but I'm still going to vote for him because I still agree with what he says. It feels right. So that's something we have seen repeatedly in the studies, and it's something that fact-checking has not fixed. I want to put that in quote marks because, of course, I had a debate about this. It wasn't meant to be a debate. I was on a panel at the Asian American Journalists Association last year, and I was having a great conversation. I was moderating it with Michelle Lee, who was one of the fact checkers at the Washington Post, and I said, well, is fact checking even making a difference if you're not changing people's votes? And she got very, sort of said, well, that's not my job. My job is not to affect how people vote. She said, my job is just to give people information and they can do whatever they want with it. So that is the perspective that some fact checkers have, and that's fine. My perspective would be that we want to give people information and have them act on the knowledge of what the correct information is, but you can't force people to think a certain way. So, and I fully accept that. I mean, one of the things that is working is that fact checkers, for example, at IFCN are working with the platforms. They're working with Facebook and they're working with Google. But they are still pushing back with the platforms on getting the amount of data that they want, getting access to it. And I know just in the last couple of days there have been some developments with Facebook announcing that they're going to let a certain panel of experts have access to their information, but it's still not something that all researchers are going to have access to. And so that's hard. If you don't know how well fact-checking is working, they gave us the figure last year, 80%. That, the fact checks that we participated in and other fact checkers participated in, that reduced by 80% the resharing of this information. But there was no background on, well, how did you come up with that number, and 80% from when, and compared to what? And so, we're going to need primary access to the material. Essentially, right now, Facebook is running the largest test in history on combating misinformation with third-party fact checkers. So if we don't learn from it, that is a huge loss. So there is a big responsibility that platforms have to share responsibly as much data as possible with researchers, with journalists, so we can actually have metrics to measure what's working and what's not.
It's amazing. We've gone 52 minutes into this panel, and this is the first actual mention of Facebook. I think that might be a record for this event. I have a lot more questions, including I want to talk about Facebook, but I feel a responsibility to let you ask questions. So I don't know if there's mics or we're just shouting or what we're doing, but right over here with your hand up. Yes, please say who you are, and if you can keep your questions, make sure it's a question, B, keep it brief, say who you are. Those are the only rules.
Hi. Is that on? My name is Maeve. I'm from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's Bureau Local Project. Often when we talk about misinformation and fact-checking, it's at a national or even international level. And I wonder what the panel's thoughts are on the role of fact-checking at local news level, but also the role of local journalists in restoring faith in the media, and what more should be done to kind of promote that.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I have a lot of thoughts about this. At least in the United States, there is a measurable difference between people's distrust in local media versus their distrust in specifically national political media. And because I worked for the last 10 years in national political and international sort of foreign policy media, I really feel passionate about trying to solve the problem of distrust in national media, but it is a much more difficult problem problem than solving the problem in local media. And from talking to Sally Lerman, who's another, from the Trust Project, who we mentioned, who's another one of Craig's grantees, from talking to Joyce Mayer, a colleague of mine who's an adjunct at Poynter, who works on the Trusting News Project, you know, they all have persuaded me that the fix and the problem I'm trying to solve is separate from the problem that they and others are trying to solve in local newsrooms. And in fact, Joy told me that she sometimes counsels local newsrooms who she works with to differentiate themselves from the national products so that they don't get tainted, you know, by the bad reputation that national political media sometimes has. So I think it's a huge problem. I'm glad that you mentioned it. I think the fix is going to be easier for local newsrooms. Not that it's easy, but because of the proximity to community, the fact that the journalists are people who live and work in the community, who go to the same school board meetings, who, you know, are related to people on the city council. And so when there's a there-ness to it, when there's a, you know, real person, real face, it makes it a lot easier to relate and to build trust and to hear, deeply listen to your audience and hear what they need and what needs to be done differently. So I feel local is an easier problem to solve.
May I add something to that?
Sure.
So Jimmy's view is that we're going, at WikiTribune, we're going global and then local. So I think actually nobody knows their communities better than local people. I think your initiative with the Bureau is absolutely astoundingly good. There's also a very clever thing in the UK now called URBS Media, URBS Media, which is doing AI-driven local news, which is now being distributed by the Press Association in the UK, which is getting around the problem that council reports and things aren't being read by a human. And so stories about pathways and sidewalks and holes in the road aren't getting done anymore, so they're going to be done by AI. But I think that local reporting is incredibly important and very easy to be done well by the community, actually.
We have a question right here. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Shane Greenup. I'm an independent entrepreneur working on the Socratic Web. Indira, when you were talking, you mentioned something about the example of CNN having to go back and explain why they made a mistake while Fox News just moved on. This raises a concern that I have with all of this, with trying to increase trust and solve these problems, that even the organisations that do already and try their best are labelled fake news by the people that disagree with them. And so it ends up becoming not about actual trust and actual, you know, validity, but just about political sides. We have the same problem in Australia with the ABC, which is really quite neutral, but constantly being called out saying they're unfair, they're left-wing biased or whatever. And also, slightly related, you mentioned pulling back the curtain as a way of sort of developing this trust. But from what I've seen of a lot of the fake news, like genuine internet-based made-up articles, they're very good at aping, pretending to be authentic and looking like authentic sources. So even with all those, you know, the example you gave, my anonymous source was from this group and we have to protect them for these reasons. I can go and write a story made up that says the same thing and completely fabricated. So how do you really establish that your media outlet is trustworthy and break through to the other side that don't care what efforts you go to?
Well, I mean, the base problem you're talking about is news literacy, right? It's about whether news consumers understand the difference between abcnews.com versus abcnews.co.something else, which is a made-up site that was one of the purveyors of fake news. I hate to use the term fake news now because it's been so bastardized, it's been appropriated by Donald Trump and turned on its head. I mean, incredibly cannily. You've got to give the guy credit. I mean, he heard the word being used and people blaming his election or saying he was elected in part because of fake news. Headlines like Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. Totally false. Or headlines like FBI agent involved in Hillary Clinton investigation found dead in murder-suicide. Totally false. You know, these are the headlines that our friend and colleague, you know, Craig Silverman, the media editor at BuzzFeed, analyzed and showed how those 20 top fake news headlines circulated 1.4 million more times on Facebook in 2016 than the real news headlines. But what I'm trying to say about that is that it's also on us as news consumers, it's on us as news producers to make it easier for news consumers to understand the difference between what's a real outlet and what's not. And the Trust Project is one of the things that is trying to do that by encouraging news organizations to put indicators that are visible on their site that sort of show this is the bio of the journalist, this is what the journalist has done. This is, you know, like all sorts of labeling on the news product that makes it more transparent and open and explains that, again, shows our work in a visible way. I mean, if you have people who just don't understand the difference between blottyblah.com and the NewYorkTimes.com, that's a larger problem, of course, and there's a variety of ways to solve it.
We have a question right here. Thank you.
Hi, Courtney Raj from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Two quick questions. One, as journalists and journalism professors, you alluded to the, you know, one small thing you can do for misinformation, which is taking the time to get it right. So how do you think about revising the constitutive rules of journalism so that, you know, this idea of the first to get it, that is not one of the most important things that journalists do. So, you know, journalism, they quote who reported it first. You know, when you're in journalism school, they talk about, you know, getting it first, and that's something we award and we, you know, give a lot of value to. So is that one way that we might look at doing that? And don't you think that journalists have kind of undermined and created an equivalency between observations, such as crediting whoever observed the drone that killed Osama bin Laden on Twitter with journalism? And is there not a difference between an observation and journalism?
Yeah. And why can't
Go
we
ahead,
rewrite the rules, honestly? I love that. And this also applies to the local question. I found that the business case for trust from a local perspective was the most salient. However, there are people who run these newsrooms, either editors or, you know, business folks, that are making all the wrong decisions. So we talk about being frustrated about the business around the local journalism model, but I think the business case is very ripe to be picked, and so we're seeing a lot of, especially European examples of folks that are just leaving their jobs to start their own thing, and there are people that are paying for it. That's the ultimate business case, which is amazing and it's super powerful, and I think part of that is to have the confidence, but also the humility to know that we might have to rewrite the rules for a new landscape, and that's okay.
I think you're starting to see that, though. I mean, I think if you read the New York Times, it's not speed that you know, they're not the first ones that break the story right now. They'll take their time, and you might see the headline, you know, 10 minutes after it's been on Twitter or a half hour after it's on Twitter. But there's something about, you know, nailing the sourcing and everything that I think they've made a decision that first isn't paramount.
I have to speak up as someone who's a former wire service reporter. I spent 8 years at Bloomberg, and Peter can speak to this, having spent so much time at Reuters. At wire services, which, let's not forget, power the majority of the news out there, because it's not just Bloomberg or Reuters or AP, it's appearing in newspapers and television and whatever all over the whole world. There is a huge primacy on being first, but accurately first. And so, you know, like we had business cards at Bloomberg for years that on the back said first, fast. I was like, first, fast, furious? Like, what is this? It was like first, fast, factual, final. You know, it was like all these F words that we were supposed to be doing. And, but, you know, it was, you know, there was a huge punishment on if you got something wrong and a huge reward if you broke big news and got it first. And I mean this literally. And you may know this, Peter, we would get like little internal Chufty badges, like awards for beating Reuters by 19 seconds, or the AP by, it happened all the time. You know, and that's the thing, like, you know, our team broke the story on the Iran deal, like by seconds, and it mattered, but we had to know that it was actually right, because if you move markets by saying it happened and it didn't happen, you're in huge trouble. So that incentive is not going to go away in all parts of
It's also
But
really
I think there's a differentiation between the wire services and the people that are not the wire services, the Wall Street Journals and the New York Times and others, who are, I think, putting more of a premium on analysis as opposed to speed, and giving more of the why does this matter rather than I'm getting it first. So I think, yes, if you're Bloomberg and you make money being first to market and people are betting hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on this kind of information, you can see why speed is part of the business model, but it doesn't have to be the business model for everyone.
Joyce, I think also people have become much, much better at acknowledging who had it first as well. And especially at the moment with this wonderful debate between or competition between the New York Times and the Washington Post, who are doing the most incredible. Each one is acknowledging the other often had it first. I think that's very impressive. But I can tell you and I knew this from Reuters, and you can see it on the internet, that being first, and certainly at CNN this was a big issue. Having something first does lead to audiences staying with you for longer. So, but that isn't a part of the business model at WikiTribune, I can tell you, because we simply cannot be competitive other than through Twitter. So Twitter has made us all competitive, except where it really counts.
I feel like the stakes have gotten much higher for getting it wrong now, the scrutiny, so
Correct.
I think that's having an impact as well. Any other questions? We have just over here.
I am John Neri. I'm an editor at the Philippine Daily Inquirer. My question is a variation on the theme of what's missing. Listening to you, I get the sense that, yes, what's happening to advanced capitalist democracies is in a way happening to us and others in Southeast Asia, but I'm seeing it like through a distorted mirror. For instance, yes, we have problems with trust, but our mainstream media organizations experiencing record traffic, our media organizations, corporate social responsibility foundations are among the most trusted in our own country. In other words, I see what you're saying, but I can't fully appreciate that. So actually, this is an invitation for you to maybe take a closer look in other parts of the world. Maybe there is something else there. It's not just trust. My own sense is people are finally realizing capitalism doesn't necessarily need to be democratic. That's what's happening to Facebook.
Good luck with that. May I answer that, Vivian? I was just last year I was the editor for a couple of months of the Phnom Penh Post in Cambodia. And in the time that I was there, the country flipped from a working democracy into a one-party state. The other English language site was shut, English language newspaper was shut down. And at the same time, completely irresponsibly in my view, Facebook did its test and the Khmer edition of the Phnom Penh Post, which had been reaching virtually the entire internet audience in Cambodia, at a stroke, lost 60% of its audience.
Everybody know about this Facebook test that he's referring to?
In Slovakia,
Cambodia. Guatemala, Cambodia, several countries. All of the news was moved out of the primary Facebook news feed and moved into a secondary feed that was just for news. It was an experiment to see whether Facebook should set up. This was about 6 months ago, and then they decided not to go forward with it.
It was incredibly dangerous.
It was very damaging in those markets.
Human Rights Watch, democracy, and now the most popular Facebook account in Cambodia is not the Khmer edition of the Phnom Penh Post. Surprise, surprise, it's Hun Sen. Okay?
Craig, did you want to?
You're right. You're right that in any of these efforts, we need to pay attention. Those of us in the United States need to look everywhere. The thing is that right now in this year, with an election coming up, we have an all-hands-on-deck crisis, and we have to prevent really bad things from happening in November. The disinformation crisis affects things like voter protection and voter suppression, because we need to encourage more people to vote rather than less people to vote.
Yeah. I would also say that it's the trust in media, in news media, is at record lows all over the world. It's certainly not a phenomenon just in one market. We have time perhaps for one more question, if anybody has one. All the way in the back over here.
Thank you very much. Yesterday I was...
I'm sorry, your name and your affiliation?
Mohammed Ittifaq, and I'm studying media and communication science in Germany.
Great.
And my question is about the fake news and fact-checking. Yesterday I was in this room, and the guy was talking about the storytelling and digitalization of media, but he started from the first sentence that the 80% of the journalists in Italy are freelancers. That was not correct statement. And then later on he made another statement like the most of the journalists are earning less than 10,000 euro per year in Italy. That was also not correct, because I went home and I checked how many freelancers in Italy, and I saw a report from the Words of Journalism Studies, and they claim in 2016 that 32% of the journalists in Italy are freelancers. So my question is how the media organizations can minimum sensitize the people that you have to do something. You are also the news consumers, so you have to do something when you are concerning about a matter or something like this. But obviously people have to do something else. They don't care about much about the media reporting and to fact checking when they go home. But sometime when we do, and in this conference, in this journalism festival, one of the speakers made incorrect statement, and I asked few people, did you check that this guy made a statement like 80% of the journalists are freelancers? He said, no. I said, okay. So then because nobody cares about, because people have a lot of things to do. So how media organizations and NGOs can minimum sensitize the people, because the fake news is not like a new term, it's just intensify after the Trump so-called, like many times repeatedly say again and again, because it was using since 1990.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at is the difficulty in scaling fact-checking. We're not at the point where fact-checking capabilities are scaled far enough that every meeting and every panel and every hotel room, every place in the world can be automatically fact-checked. So I guess I would turn that question to the ability to scale fact-checking.
Well, can I just say one thing about that? I mean, I think he's also talking about personal responsibility, that we all have a personal responsibility to be factually correct when we speak, and we should all be vetting our own sources and our own statements, and I agree with you. Yes, we all have a personal responsibility. I just wanted to add one thing to what Craig said about how it's all hands on deck in the United States, and how vitally, I mean, what I really appreciate from Craig and other funders of journalism now is that they understand the link between an educated populace and a healthy democracy. That is the baseline thing we're talking about here, people. If I could just put it in one line for you. We are talking about the connection between informing people using facts, right? So that and a healthy democracy. And we see how when you misinform people, how democracy is very vulnerable and actually can start falling apart. And so what I think is really important for those of you who haven't seen it, take a look. Just a few days ago, Politico did a large analysis, which I had talked to them about a year ago. I'm so happy they did it. And it was, they mapped news deserts in America, overlaid it with voting patterns, and they were able to establish a correlation between the lowest information pockets in America and where Trump won. They can't prove a causation, but there's a definite correlation between news deserts and areas that voted for Trump. Now, this is not about, I'm not trying to make this about Trump. I'm trying to make this about low information voters. And it's our responsibility as journalists, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, and Joyce is doing this work globally, and it makes me so happy to, strengthen democracy through correct information.
I do think that we've talked about media literacy a lot on the panel, but how we really have an effective media literacy embedded in all of our education systems, so that it's not a one-off course that you take here and there, but that children learn to check what's out there. And they think that they're digital natives, they know their way around, and to some degree they do, but there's a lot of responsibility that belongs on the consumer, and I think it has to be embedded in a much more effective way in all of our education systems.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you in the room. We can continue this conversation, and we'll check in on it next year.
It seems like it's